Hello, guys. My name's Eliana. I'm a biochem major, and my Keystone project, advised by the lovely Dr. Zions, is titled Research Innovation from Public-Private Partnerships, an examination of the Novartis Africa Sickle Cell Disease Program. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of context. So a public-private partnership is essentially where a public agency, typically a federal government, and then a private entity partner, in this case, which will be Novartis, which is a pharmaceutical company, they partner together to deliver a project or service, and this one is essentially for treating sickle cell disease. But essentially, what is sickle cell disease? I know that most people have heard of sickle cell anemia, but sickle cell disease is sort of like the umbrella term for it. Sickle cell anemia is a version of sickle cell disease, but it's like a terrible hemoglobin disorder. You can see in the image there, we have the really nice round circled blood cells, and then the ones that are shaped oddly, and those are sickle cells, and those can be super painful. They can lead to these painful crises where people have said that it feels like they're getting stabbed over and over again, or that they've been hit by a truck. And it can even lead to death, so it's a huge problem. And essentially what this public-private partnership, the Novartis Sickle Cell Disease Africa program, sought out to do is to help treat sickle cell disease. But what makes them different from from other interventions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa with HIV and AIDS, is their focus on research in sickle cell disease, not only just treatment. So the burden of sickle cell disease in sub-Saharan Africa is huge. You can see from this graph here that most of the countries that have the number of expected sickle cell disease births per 1,000 of being greater than 6 are predominantly located in sub-Saharan Africa. The really dark red one is Nigeria, which means that they have 1 in 10 births with sickle cell disease. And it's just a huge problem, particularly because sickle cell disease, or the genotype, arose as a way to prevent malaria. So because of that, they're more susceptible to sickle cell disease because they're in areas that malaria is more prevalent. So zooming out a little bit, the main problem that I was focusing on is how Africa holds 20% of the global population, 25% of disease burden, but only outputs around 1% of global research. So the question that I wanted to look into is, using this program as a case study, how can we gauge the research innovation in developing countries that might result from one of these public-private partnerships? So in order to do this, I used the map from earlier to determine my treated and controlled. They all have above 6 per 1,000 births with sickle cell disease. So what I did is I pulled the publications from Web of Science between the years of 2009 and 2024, and then I sorted them by year and then also by the country. And then following that, what I did is statistical analysis on the number of publications in those countries, before and after, to determine if there is a significant difference between the before and the after. So before we get into the actual statistical analysis, this is just the raw data counts. So you can see the blue one, which is the treated group. They have a giant spike in 2019, which is the year that the intervention went into place in the first country. However, I'll talk a little bit more about the rollout. But you can see there's a huge difference in 2019 from the treatment to no treatment group. There's a giant spike. So we sort of thought there has to be something going on. So we wanted to explore it a little bit more deeply. And then I'm not going to get too far into the econometrics behind it because I'm still a beginner myself. But essentially what we can see here is that so there's a dropped year, which is the year before the intervention. So the year that the intervention rolled out, we decided to make that the year 0. And then you can see the dotted line is 0. So before the intervention, all of the numbers are near 0 or below 0. And then afterwards, after the intervention, we see it becomes above 0. However, because we have these large error bars, we can't say for sure that the program actually is directly involved with the amount of publications or the change or the increase in that, but it's still super important, and it probably did have something to do with it. We just can't say for sure. So speaking more on the significance of this, I want to talk about the program itself and how important the collaborations between local and international stakeholders are. There's really not going to be any buy-in if you only have some international stakeholder coming in saying, hey, do this, but there's no way to make the local people do that. And what makes Novartis different is how they involve their local researchers, hospitals, and stuff, and promote the research as well, which leads to this information exchange, which is directly tied to research innovation. And then also the importance of building infrastructure to help establish and maintain these public-private partnerships. Essentially, if they, like, similarly to before, if they didn't get any buy-in, they wouldn't be able to continue it. And also, these federal governments don't want to be relying on this private enterprise for the entire time in order for this to continue to facilitate. So they want to be able to build their own infrastructure and do that as well. And then finally, how more health research leads to better health outcomes. So if we're producing more health research, particularly in these less developed countries, they'll have better health outcomes. And then I have a couple policy suggestions for these public-private partnerships, so particularly with the health ones. So they should mobilize local and international stakeholders to catalyze innovation. Sort of like I said before, like you need the buy-in, and then you also need this exchange between the two of them in order to continue for it to be sustainable. And then also how impact should go beyond treatment and acknowledge the importance of building research infrastructure. So while the Novartis intervention is like centered on treatment, like they give more access to treatment drugs for sickle cell disease, being able to build this research infrastructure is super important to sustain it, and that they should consider explicit research support mechanisms as core elements of their program moving forward. And then I have a couple limitations for the data. So there was a pretty small data set, like I said, from 2009 to 2024. It's not a lot of data, especially because the intervention occurred in the first country in 2019. So that's only like 5 years of data, which is not really enough to say that something is really happening. There's also variation in the country level research capacity. So like Ghana is obviously going to be able to produce more than some of the other countries. I think they're top 10 in like producing research in Africa. And then also because the intervention rolled out in different years. So it started in 2019 in Ghana, and then the countries following it happened in 2020 and 2022 respectively. So that's why we also saw like those pretty large error bars going back. And because it's staggered, we can't say for sure that it's causal as well. And then for my next steps, obviously, we'd want to run a staggered difference in differences regression, which is like the statistical analysis I had done earlier. However, it's going to be a while before we can get any of that kind of data. And then also being able to control for allocated health research funds in these developing countries, it's pretty difficult to get access to that kind of stuff. I think when I looked, it was only through 2018, so you can't really control for that. And then finally, to investigate programs and funding from Novartis to see like how much they've allocated to each thing, to see if we can determine that that is what's helping to cause this increase in innovation. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Eliana, a brilliant job. I was curious, yesterday I was reading about the youngest Gates, Phoebe Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates' youngest daughter, and she was mentioning how a lot of her summers were spent in Africa. To what extent, as we look at PPP, does a Gates Foundation potentially come into your work to date? Brilliant, but also next steps.
Well, the Bill and Melinda Gates are one of the stakeholders in this intervention, actually. So right now what they're doing is they're hoping to find a way to make like it's like a gene thing, like to inject it, so it'd be like a one-stop shop to help treat sickle cell disease. So I think like being able to see how much funding they're putting into that and like what kind of research they're doing there would probably be what I would want to look into.
And does a Gates Foundation bring in Novartis, or is it Novartis Foundation that brings in Gates?
I'm pretty sure it's a mutual collaboration between the two. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Lovely job.
Thank you.
So you and I talked a lot, right, about you're a scientist, like a real scientist.
Yes.
Right? I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about your experience in shifting from being a research scientist to all of a sudden now doing sort of this social science policy research. Like, what kinds of things did you see that were similar? What kinds of things did you learn that were different?
I mean, I think that like the scientific method holds true between the two. So I think that it helped that I had the I don't like hard science research because I could like see I needed like a step-by-step kind of thing, but like this was like it felt like operating in the gray area, which I am not super comfortable with. So I think that like getting to learn about how like, especially in life, like you live in the gray area. So being able to navigate stuff like that, especially because in like hard science, if your results don't go the way you want them to, you just run it again, usually. But this one, it's like, oh, like we ran into so many different problems, and it's like, okay, how can I keep it like similar to this, but like use that to connect it back to the original idea, which I think is what I learned is like there's a lot of roundabout ways of getting through things, and like if you hit a wall, go around it. So yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested in the line you had about more health research leads to better health outcomes. That's really intriguing. If I would think that if you wanted better health outcomes, you'd provide more health care. So can you sort of talk about why is it that more health research will lead to better health outcomes? And if you were a policymaker, would you invest in research or would you invest in care?
I think that particularly with sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of mistrust in the health that's like right now. And they barely invest in health as it is. I think it's like 0.1% goes into healthcare in most of those countries, which don't even get me started on that. But I think that in particular, the idea of like being able to establish, especially because they use a lot of like drugs, there's like a really general mistrust of that kind of thing. So I think being able to establish like, hey, this works, you should try it, might be worthwhile. I think that it should be half and half, which I that might be a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think that they should take both into account when doing that.